Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of The Bitter Pill. A few days ago I did a video about primarily focused on research showing the efficacy of wearing masks as a means of preventing the spread of COVID and other infectious diseases. And basically, in a nutshell, the conclusion that an overwhelming preponderance of the research has reached is that wearing masks is one of several very effective measures for cutting down greatly on the spread of COVID and various other infectious diseases. So I got a little bit of pushback in the comments on that video from mask skeptics. So, for example, one person said, "I have to disagree with you. From what I have seen, research has not shown that masks work." And he cited a few studies that he thought showed that. Actually, one of the studies simply compared the efficacy of different types of masks and didn't at all draw a conclusion that masks didn't work. And I didn't go through all the studies. I'll do that some other time, I guess. But I didn't really see much indication that people were concluding definitively that masks didn't work in the studies that he cited. But again, as I discussed last time, there have been dozens of controlled experiments and hundreds of observational studies, often in the latter case, with data that lend themselves to causal inferences. So, for example, you have essentially a natural experiment where at time A, you have various measures introduced other than mask mandates for trying to control a virus, like having people stay home from work and so forth. And then at a later date, a city introduces a mask mandate. And then the study shows that just that one change and no other changes further reduces the rate of growth in new infections to a significantly greater extent than those other measures that were already in place. And since I did that video, I came across an interesting article in Vox, which I'll put in the description of the video, that compared New York City and Hong Kong. So I just wanted to mention a few highlights from that. So they say New York City, with a population of about 8.4 million, has had over 28,000 coronavirus deaths as of May 18th. Meanwhile, Hong Kong has officially recorded only 4 COVID-19 deaths, despite having 7.5 million residents, an almost identical number of people. One reason that could help explain the stark disparity is that in Hong Kong, nearly everyone wears a face mask in public. And if any city in the world was likely to experience the worst effects of the coronavirus, Hong Kong would have been a top candidate. The area is densely populated and, much like New York, very heavily reliant on public transit systems that are very crowded, very packed. And in addition to that, unlike New York, there happens to be a high-speed train that connects Hong Kong to Wuhan, China, where the coronavirus originated. And it's a bullet train, so I forget exactly how far Wuhan is from Hong Kong, but not that far, so it takes not long at all. And it seems like that would be a recipe for disaster. But almost as soon as the outbreak started in Hong Kong, millions of residents started wearing masks in public. And as I told the fellow who commented on my last video, my business partner, Mark, happens to live in Hong Kong. And he confirmed to me that pretty much everybody there wears a mask, well over 99% of people, and that really the only people that he saw not wearing masks were, surprise, surprise, Americans living in Hong Kong or visiting Hong Kong. And so folks who've studied the situation argued that widespread mask use appears to be a major reason, maybe even the main one, why the city hasn't had anything even remotely approaching the outbreak that New York had. If not for universal masking, once we depart from our home every day, plus hand hygiene, Hong Kong would be like Italy long ago, said K.Y. Yuen, a Hong Kong microbiologist who advised the local government. Somebody else said not wearing masks in Hong Kong is like not wearing pants. But actually, ironically, there have been these protests in Hong Kong, and we can get into the nature of those protests some other time, but there were anti-government protests that got quite spirited, even violent. Some innocent people were killed by protesters, and unlike in the United States, the police in Hong Kong were not brutal toward the protesters. But in any case, one of the measures that the government took to try and control the protests was that the Hong Kong government actually banned the wearing of face masks in public. And that ban was actually still in place when the virus hit China and ultimately Hong Kong, part of China, but kind of a quasi-independent entity. Because they were hoping that forcing the demonstrators to show their faces would encourage them to stay home. But anyway, so the ban's still on when the coronavirus hits, but people started wearing masks en masse anyway. And the Hong Kong government actually, although it was suggested by public health experts, I don't think they ever did overturn the ban. But people ignored what the law said and wore masks pretty close to universally. And there are certainly other important measures that Hong Kong took. They implemented a very strong testing and tracing and isolation of positive cases program. And they did close some establishments. They closed bars. They restricted entry at the border. But there is research that suggests that the masks also played an important role. So Ben Cowling, the head of epidemiology at the University of Hong Kong's School of Public Health, said that a mask could catch a lot of the virus a sick person would otherwise be breathing or coughing out. Wearing them at least provides some protection from others. And he and his colleagues did a study that seemed to show that. And researchers at the University of Hong Kong calculated that if 80% of a population can be persuaded to wear masks, transmission levels will be cut to 1/12 of what you would have in a society where people didn't wear masks. And then there was a study that I mentioned last time, also done by researchers at University of Hong Kong, where they had 52 hamsters in cages, where some of the hamsters were infected with COVID by the researchers. And, as I've told you before on this show, I'm an animal rights guy, so I'm not too fond of anybody, infecting hamsters or anything else with potentially deadly diseases. But in any case, since they did the study, I'll tell you what they found. They found that non-contact transmission dropped by around 75% when there was a mask material partition between the infected and non-infected groups of hamsters' cages. And also, as I mentioned last time, the rate of symptoms was greatly reduced as well. And I guess I have to ask people who are skeptical about masks or don't believe that they work at all. The question I have for you is, how does it really hurt you to wear a mask? How is it any bigger deal for a business to ask you to wear a mask in their establishment than for them to ask you to wear a shirt or wear pants or whatever? Now, granted, if you go to work all day and you're around a lot of other people, so the boss requires you to wear a mask, or you just decide, um, you and your coworkers decide for your own protection and protection for customers as well, to wear masks. Um, it's a pain in the ass to wear masks for hours on end, of course. Nobody really wants to do that. I'm fortunate enough to work from home, so the only time I have to wear a mask or choose to wear a mask is if I go out to a store, which typically I don't go inside, but in any case, um, you know, that's no big deal. You just wear it for a few minutes. But even if you don't believe that masks help or you doubt the efficacy of masks, how on earth does it hurt you to wear a mask? Some people have said, oh, it restricts your breathing and lowers your oxygen levels, so it's unhealthy. Well, first of all, doctors and nurses wear masks all day, quite often, and you don't really complain about it. That's just part of the job. And some healthcare professionals actually took to social media to try and debunk these claims that mask wearing reduces oxygen levels. So let me show you some of the things they said. For one thing, it's not physically possible for a face mask to block the exchange of gas molecules through the mask material. The pores aren't small enough to block airflow, even with an N95 respirator. Of course, they're not small enough to block viruses either, but as we discussed last time, the viruses don't just float around by themselves. They travel in water droplets, and the masks do provide a barrier to the transmission of these water vapor droplets. And on the other hand, the claim that wearing a face mask causes oxygen deficiency is just flat out contradicted by the evidence. Surgeons do perhaps hours-long operations. They wear surgical masks for the entire time, and their oxygen levels, their carbon dioxide levels, etc., are fine. Which they'd better be, because you don't want to have a surgeon who's not alert and fully there mentally. But that doesn't appear to happen. So I mentioned doctors and so forth getting on social media to talk about this issue. So Albert Rizzo, for example, the chief medical officer for the American Lung Association, said a normal pulse oxygen level is around 95 to 97%. And health professionals demonstrated under various scenarios that while wearing masks, they maintained oxygen saturation levels of between 98 and 100% while breathing through surgical masks. So Nicole Baldwin, MD, says, or she shows actually her pulse oximeter reading 100% while she's wearing a surgical mask, and she actually put nail polish on top of the mask to reduce the flow of air, and still got that level. Another doctor, Mark Lewis, wore an entire box of surgical masks on his face, and his blood oxygen saturation level read 99%. Another doctor, Tom Lawton, did a 20-mile run while wearing a face mask, And I don't know if you've exercised with a mask on. I've done it briefly, and it's not much fun. It is a little harder to um, get enough air in if you're really going at it hard. Um, and so he said it was unpleasant, but he also reported that his oxygen levels measured with a pulse oximeter were 98 to 99% all the time, completely normal oxygen levels. The whole 21, I believe it was, miles. Normal is anything above 95. Now, of course, masks don't provide perfect protection. As I talked about last time, you do have infections among people and transmitted from person to person when people are wearing masks. If they're in kind of a crowded indoor environment, definitely reduces the rate of transmission quite significantly. But people can still get it. But typically their symptoms are less severe if they do get it, and often they don't. So actually, my mom, unfortunately has Alzheimer's, so she's in a memory care unit in a nursing home. And many of the residents of the nursing home, including her, got COVID from some of the staff, even though the staff did wear masks while at work. But as far as I'm aware, not a single one of these quite elderly people, my mom is 81, for example, who got sick with COVID, none of them died from it. So it's not a death sentence even for the elderly. And that's more the case if viral exposure is limited by, for example, wearing masks. But this is definitely a disease to take very seriously. It's extremely contagious, more so than the common flu or cold, because it's a novel virus, a novel coronavirus. People don't have pre-existing immunity to it, unlike with colds. Even people have had them before, so they have some resistance to them. But and it's definitely a more serious thing to have than typical seasonal flu. We don't really, it's really impossible to give exact figures for fatality rates because we don't have very good estimates, as I talked about last time, of the number of cases of infection with COVID. We don't really have good estimates for the number of infections with flu either, because they don't do random samples of people who've been tested for COVID. You have bias samples because obviously people are a lot more likely to get tested if either they have symptoms or they're not sure they have it and they're planning on being around other people who they don't want to expose to it if they do have it. And then most people don't get tested because they don't feel like they need to. So in any case, if you just look at the death rates, though, you can count how many people die, and if they've had a test, then you know whether or not they had COVID when they died. And 169,000 people or so, which happens to be 5,000 more people than when I made the previous video on this topic just 4 days ago, have died from it here in the United States. And some of those people were not in any apparent high-risk category. Just the other day, a 7-year-old boy who didn't have any known pre-existing health conditions died. And many people who recovered had developed long-term health complications as a result. So even young and apparently healthy people have developed serious health complications from infections with COVID. So recently it's been revealed that more than a dozen college athletes who had COVID have been diagnosed with myocarditis, a condition involving an inflamed heart that can potentially be fatal. So let me just talk about some of this article. It was in ESPN on ESPN's website. So I'll post a link to it. But just to briefly read some excerpts from it, they interviewed a woman whose son played football at Indiana University, IU as we call it around here, the local university here. So heart issues linked to COVID-19, they say in this article, gained attention last week after the mother of Indiana offensive lineman Feeney posted her son's plight on Facebook. She wrote, "Unfortunately, this virus hit my son very hard compared to most of his teammates. Here was a kid in perfect health, great physical condition, and due to the virus ended up going to the ER because he had difficulty breathing. After 14 days of hell battling this horrible virus, his school did additional testing on all those that were positive on the team. My son even received extra tests because he was one of the worst cases. Now we are dealing with possible heart issues. He is still experiencing additional symptoms, and his blood work is indicating additional problems. Bottom line, even if your son's schools do everything right to protect them, they can't protect them. In other words, if you get infected, there's the possibility of serious complications." Feeney, an incoming freshman from St. Louis, was scheduled to visit a cardiologist last week. On Monday, in response to college football players around the country joining to tweet hashtag We Want to Play, Feeney wrote on Twitter, "COVID-19 is serious. I never thought I would have serious health complications from the virus, but look at what happened. We need to listen to our medical experts." And actually, partly in response to reports like this, the Big Ten, excuse me, the Big Ten Conference, which Indiana is in, has canceled the football season. I guess they're planning to play in the spring. University of Houston defensive lineman Cedric Williams announced on Facebook on Saturday that he was opting out of the 2020 season because of heart problems associated with COVID-19. Williams tested positive in June and spent 14 days in quarantine. "As a result of the virus, I've had complications with my heart, and I really don't know the outcome or what's in store for me in the future," Williams wrote. "I just know that my life is more precious to me than football could ever be. I've decided to opt out of the 2020 football season due to these complications." And he's hoping to come back eventually, but for now, he's trying to take care of his health and not take any risks and not playing football for the time being. So, in a nutshell, if you think that, I'm young and healthy and don't have any known health conditions, so I'm not really at risk, that isn't necessarily true. You don't know for sure. This could conceivably affect any of us in a serious way. See, for example, the 7-year-old boy in apparently very good health who recently died from it in Georgia. And even if you get it and your symptoms are mild or you're asymptomatic, you could pass it on to someone else who could suffer a lot worse case than you do. So, maybe, if I got it and I went to visit my mom in her nursing home and didn't wear a mask, well, of course they won't allow me to do that, but if that were possible, I could give her a much worse case of it and she could die from it. And personally, I just turned 59. I've got asthma, not severe asthma, but I've got asthma. So I wouldn't say that I'm low risk, even though I'm in good health. So I don't really know what would happen if I got it. And really, I'd rather not find out. So, if for whatever reason, maybe you found some studies that raised doubts in your mind, the bottom line is that there are many studies, including meta-analyses that combine the results of many studies to find overall differences, across those studies that had, because the differences were consistently found in study after study, when they did the combined statistical analysis, they found basically there was just an infinitesimally small chance that one after another study could be finding these results of statistically significant differences between mask wearing versus non-mask wearing in rates of infection and severity of symptoms and so forth. And there are very few studies that haven't found that masks were helpful. And really, it's just sort of a common sense question. You have to ask yourself, how could they not help? I showed you the video in the last video I did on this, where it was showing masks dramatically reducing the amount of liquid that was spewing out from the spray can that the guy was using. And there have been controlled experiments that have found that masks dramatically reduce the number of infectious droplets that get through the mask when people cough or sneeze. So at this point, the overwhelming scientific consensus, not just here in the United States, but in countries throughout the world, and the vast majority of countries in the world are much more likely to have a high rate of mask wearing, if not almost universal, than the United States. And in country after country, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that masks are helpful. And since, unless you think you've got, unless you're quite sure that all these scientists are wrong, I mean, the burden of proof is on you. And, if you have doubts, even if you have doubts, maybe you even lean toward thinking that they aren't effective, unless you somehow scientifically conclusively proved that masks don't work, and you haven't, the only socially responsible thing to do is to err on the side of caution, just in case you're wrong. Maybe you have doubts about whether other things are harmful. Secondhand smoke, let's say, or driving under the influence of some drug other than alcohol, which I hope you don't have any doubts about the riskiness of driving drunk, because I'm never fucking getting in a car with you if that's the case. But, what if secondhand smoke or, let's say driving under the influence of pot, let's say those things actually are harmful. And there hasn't been much research done on marijuana, so I guess we don't really know for sure that it's it impairs your driving enough to greatly increase the frequency of accidents. And anecdotally, a lot of people say they don't feel as impaired when they smoke pot as when they drink. But you never know. What if it actually does put other people at risk if you do that? And similarly, what if it actually does put other people at risk if you're unknowingly infected with a serious infectious disease and aren't wearing a mask and you're in close proximity to other people, especially if you're indoors, because the ability of the virus to be transmitted to others is much greater in closed-in spaces, the research suggests. And so if you're wrong and you infect somebody and they die, you're responsible for somebody's death. If you're wrong and you make somebody seriously ill, maybe they have long-term health consequences, like possibly befell some of those football players that I was just talking about, you're responsible for inflicting severe negative health consequences on somebody. And hopefully you don't want that on your conscience. So that's about all I have to say this time. Once again, this is, I think it's episode 25 of the Bitter Pill. I hope you've enjoyed it. I will put links to some of the articles I've talked about in the description of the video. Please like and comment and subscribe to the channel if you like what you've seen here or other videos. And I will see you next time.